Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us today for our third conference in our Work Wellness Institute conference series. We are so happy to have you here, and we're excited to be spending the day together breaking down the reality of workplace wellness with you all. My name is Emma Bisco. I am a Learning and Development Coordinator with the Work Wellness Institute, and I will be opening and closing all of our sessions today, so you will be seeing my face. Before I begin, I'd like to draw your attention to the accessibility button on the top right-hand side of your screen. It's just to the left of the notification bell. Please use this feature to ensure FeedLoop is optimized to you and your needs. Unfortunately, there is an incompatibility issue between FeedLoop and Zoom, which has temporarily disabled the integrations of closed captionings. If you require captioning, please find the orange chat box on the bottom left-hand side of your screen, and a member of our team will provide you with the solution. I've been informed from Zoom and FeedLoop that they are actively working on a solution, and we are hopeful that the feature will be restored at some point in our day today. So should that happen, you'll see a CC button show up right below my screen. You'll be able to click that, and we're keeping our fingers crossed that'll be coming through. But with that, I'd like to begin our time together by acknowledging that I have the privilege to live and work on the traditional and ancestral and unceded territory of the Coast Salish peoples, Squamish, Tsleil-Waututh, and Musqueam nations. I'd also like to thank our funders, our speakers, all of our partners, and all of you for making this conference possible. With that, I'll hand it over to our Vice President, Camila Caroli, who has some opening remarks for us all.
Good morning and good afternoon. Welcome and thank you for joining us today. As Emma mentioned, this is the Work Wellness Institute's third conference of a three-part conference series. My name is Camila Caroli. I'm Vice President of the Work Wellness Institute. And I want to upfront thank our wonderful team for their work and dedication to planning and organizing and making this conference happen, and to our speakers and moderators who have dedicated their time, expertise, and insights. For those of you new to us, we were founded as a research institute in the 80s, and our mandate has since evolved. We work closely with academic industry and community partners as a research institute, but also as a community partner, knowledge mobilizer, and funder. As an organization, we are committed to our vision of supporting the creation of safe, healthy, and inclusive workplaces for all. And we do this through research and through turning that research into timely, credible, and relevant practical resources, such as this conference today. Resources that translate findings into the individual knowledge required to influence a shift in work culture. That shift that recognizes the value of the individual's contribution to the performance of the workplace and the tools required to remove the barriers to employment and opportunity that get in the way of too many individuals' ability to fully do so, to fully contribute. Example resource topics include employee-focused leadership, diversity, inclusion, and equity, accommodation, recruitment and retention, episodic disability, and return to work. Internally, we organize our processes, workflows, and continuous improvement cycles on this idea, on a continuum of research to practice and all the elements along the way. And through our current research and programming initiatives, Work Wellness Institute is specifically focused. We have a seat at the table on removing barriers to employment opportunity for those living with visible and invisible disability, and equally significant, the knowledge and resources necessary to support the creation of the inclusive, healthy, safe, and performing workplaces required to realize that rich contribution of individuals as those barriers are addressed. And why is this important? So 1 in 5 Canadians are living with at least one disability, a statistic that is on course to become 1 out of 4 as the Canadian population ages. And demographic employment income profile of Canadians with disabilities aged 15 years and over was conducted by the Canadian government back in 2017. And that study showed that among those with disabilities aged 24 to 64 who were not employed, not currently in school, 39% had that potential and willingness to work. And the impact of that, according to a TD's Insight publication released only a couple of years later, 2019, even moderate success in narrowing existing labor market gaps between people living with disabilities and the general population could provide a Canadian economic impact of more than $50 billion. And that doesn't necessarily account for the potential socioeconomic impact overall. It doesn't account for all those other untapped labor markets that we will explore in this conference. A disruption like a global pandemic has only exacerbated the need to engage and recruit a diverse workforce. And why a conference series? And throughout COVID, like many, the Work Wellness Institute had to reimagine how we do business. With a national mandate and virtually based, we had a lot of opportunities in front of us and also limitations as the entire world went online. And as a megaphone for relevant and timely research, our mandate became more urgent. And as the online world grew noisier and the very real concept of things like Zoom fatigue hit many of us, we decided to build on our flagship webinar series, which has been a primary format for getting research out to our audiences. And we saw an opportunity to make more of a meal out of the richness, depth of knowledge and conversation of our presenters and speakers. And so the virtual conference series brings together recognized experts and professionals, different voices and perspectives to discuss current and emerging ideas and research that are impacting organizations' ability to build those resilient performing workplaces that directly benefit from creating environments that support diversity and engage their employees. Our first conference, Exploring the Reality of Inclusive Work, Return to Work, looked at what did that mean? What did returning to work mean in this time of disruption, and the obstacles and opportunities from both a national and international perspective. Our second conference really explored the future of work. What were those emerging trends of work, from that increased employment rates in precarious or temporary work in the gig economy, and who were taking those jobs, and the role of technology and AI, and then the policy considerations of alternative ways to work as COVID kind of threw us into this world where hybrid, remote, and flexible work environments have become much more commonplace. Today, we have a very impressive lineup of speakers and moderators that I can't thank enough as we break down elements of workplace wellness from the current employment landscape. Over the past few years, how we live, communicate, and work has changed in ways we didn't predict. We have really an opportunity today and in general to examine how we define work wellness and build those flexible, resilient, and performing work environments. Diversity is key. And to move forward, organizations must consider how an active commitment to redefining wellness practices can positively impact employees and their workplaces. The report released by Statistics Canada this year reported that when only workers who were active or on paid leave were taken into account, the net effect of COVID-19 on hours worked in the business sector alone was a loss of close to 56 million hours in the fourth quarter. COVID has only further exposed what we've already known. Our first session really examines the need to tap into the untapped, unemployed, and underemployed talent pool where barriers to employment and opportunity remain high for too many. And when we look at the currently employed, according to a 2022 Robert Half research report, almost 4 in 10 Canadian workers report increased burnout. And that survey of 500 professionals in Canada found that not only did 4 in 10 employees identify as burned out, 45% of respondents overall are hesitant to discuss burnout with their bosses. So in our second session, our speakers explore burnout and disclosure. Our workforce is stressed. Burnout has never received so much media attention as it does now, and it is real. And the consequences on individual employees, teams, and organizational resilience and performance has been significant. In our final session, we look at a flexible work policies as recruitment and retention incentives and what it takes to implement them. Again, we have a fantastic lineup for today's conference. We encourage you to attend each session and invite you to reflect, think critically, and learn from these discussions. Reach out to us, reach out to each other. We hope that you are inspired and walk away wanting to learn more about the topics raised and addressing some of today's challenges in harnessing that abundant potential of people. So enjoy, and I'm going to hand it back to Emma. Thank you.
Hey, wonderful. Thank you, Camila. Our opening session today is Untap Talent, Addressing the Gaps in the Labor Market. To moderate this panel, we are so pleased to welcome Todd Humber. Todd Humber is an award-winning journalist who has spent his career covering issues of importance to business leaders, HR professionals, employment lawyers, occupational health and safety professionals, and more. He spent more than 2 decades with Thomson Reuters as publisher and editor-in-chief in Canadian HR Reporter and its family of publications. He spent 3 years with Annex Business Media, Canada's largest B2B publisher, as a member of the senior management team. He also served stints in mainstream media, including editorial roles at daily newspapers across Ontario, including the Woodstock Centennial Review, Oshawa News, Cobber Daily Star, and Port Hope Evening Guide. Thank you, Todd, and over to you to introduce our panelists and session topic. Thank you.
Thanks, Emma, for that very kind introduction. Now it's my job to actually introduce the real stars of our panel this morning, 2 very accomplished professionals. First up is Dr. Susan Elizabeth Peters. Susan is a research scientist and project lead for the Thriving Workers, Thriving Workplaces study at the Harvard T.H. Chan Center for Work, Health, and Well-Being. She has been involved in the development, implementation, and testing of participatory integrated organizational interventions, try saying that really fast a couple of times, in transportation, construction, and food service designed to improve the safety, health, and well-being of our workers. Susan recently led the development of the Thriving from Work conceptual framework and questionnaires. Her current field of research is focusing on how working conditions and public and organizational policies shape thriving workers, workforces, and workplaces. She has research interests in how the COVID-19 pandemic has accelerated the changes anticipated in the future of work, the workforces and workplaces, and recently led an article published in the Lancet, the Lancet Public Health on the implications of work and worker health in the post-pandemic world. Also joining us this morning, we have Olga Stakova. Olga is the CEO of Mosaic, a registered charity serving immigrant, refugee, migrant, and mainstream communities in Vancouver, the Fraser Valley, and throughout the province of British Columbia. Its broad range of services include settlement support, English language training, employment assistance, and family services. Mosaic serves more than 30,000 clients annually from 51 accessible locations in the Greater Vancouver area and also in the Lower Mainland of BC. She has more than 20 years experience managing fast-growing distributed nonprofit organizations, as well as operational expertise in program delivery, design, and evaluation. Lastly, and this is kind of cool, she is the recipient of the 2009 Business in Vancouver Top 40 Under 40 Award, as well as the Queen Elizabeth II Diamond Jubilee Medal. She also serves currently on the Metro Vancouver Regional Economic Prosperity Management Board. So welcome, Susan and Olga. We're so thrilled to have you join us this morning, and I'm really looking forward to this conversation. So, we know that employers are facing a ton of issues in the current labor market, especially when it comes to things like recruitment and retention. So, Susan, we'll start with you this morning. I'm going to pass the microphone over to you to get this conversation started.
Welcome, everybody. I am so happy to be presenting to you guys today. Heard that there's over 430 of you potentially dialing in, which is very exciting. As Todd mentioned, my name's Susan Peters. I'm a research scientist at the Harvard T.H. Chan Center for Work, Health, and Well-Being. We are one of 10 centers of excellence of total worker health, which really focus on how policies, programs, and practices impact work and the conditions of work that we're exposed to, and how that has an impact on worker health, safety, and well-being, as well as key enterprise outcomes that we care about. So today I'm going to be talking about some of the factors that contribute to what we call thriving from work, and how workers can thrive from the work that they do both at work and outside of work, and how this leads to us thinking about how groups of workers can be thriving, so thriving workforces and also thriving workplaces. So I just want to start by saying I have no conflicts. I do receive funding, and the contents of this presentation are solely my own. So as Camilla pointed out, some of these phrases that you are seeing on the screen here are phrases that are kind of being talked about in the workplace. And you're probably talking about it in relation to your workers, the company that you work at, and really became quite pronounced during the pandemic. As Camilla mentioned, we're seeing greater rates of burnout. The mental health of workers is really a great concern. And we're really starting to think about some of these questions. And today, what I'm hoping to do is kind of walk through some of the factors that are contributing to these questions that we're asking, what's causing some of these phenomena that we're seeing in our current workforces, and how are these kind of impacting the way that workers are thinking about their work, the decisions they're making about staying at work or potentially moving to another employer, but also thinking about it from an employer lens. What can employers be doing, or what can we be looking at? What are the factors within the workplace that could be improved that could help to manage some of these things? So I have two kind of learning objectives today for the session. The first, I'm going to walk you through a conceptual framework that helps us to think about the different forces and how they're interconnected at these different systems levels that really impact worker well-being and the labour market. And then applying a thriving from work framework to really understand these diverse factors and what workplaces might be able to do. So this is a conceptual model that we developed at the centre based on decades of research, both at our centre and across other research institutions, that we have adapted to really start to think about some of these factors that are impacting our current workforce. This model, as you can see, is really a systems or an ecological model where we're really starting to think about the trends or the factors that we're seeing that were really accelerated by the pandemic and some of the disparities that were exacerbated as a result of the pandemic, and how this has fundamentally changed the way work and the way it's structured. It's highlighted some areas, but really what this model does is it helps us to consider the factors that contribute to worker, workforce, and enterprise health and well-being. This model really helps us to think about the diverse ways that employment, work and working conditions are connected and how they're influenced by employment and labour patterns, as well as the social, political and economic environment in which they're contained. I just want to point out that this is by no means an exhaustive list of all of the factors. If we were to do that, I would be here for hours. But really today, I'm just going to highlight some examples and really kind of get us thinking about how these different levels really impact worker well-being at its core and the decisions that employers and workers make. So I'm going to walk through in the next couple of slides each of these levels and talk about some examples and how they impact worker well-being in the labour market. So first, thinking about the social, political and economic environment and how that's impacting employment and labour patterns and enterprises and workers. So we've really seen a rising globalization of financial markets, and during the pandemic, we saw disruptions to supply chains, which affected many sectors. And these global kind of economic trends that we're seeing really influence the job market and the distribution of jobs across different sectors. They shape businesses and workers' occupations and jobs. We're really seeing, because of what's happening at this kind of larger level, that new jobs are emerging. We're adopting more technologies, biotech's becoming a big thing, which is resulting in us needing new skills and training to kind of adapt to those emerging kind of areas. We're seeing a rapid adoption of emerging technologies, automation, e-commerce, robotics, AI, machine learning, just to name a few, which also require an increase in upskilling and training across those things. We're seeing a change in consumer behaviours, which during the pandemic, we all learnt how to order things online pretty easily. There's been a rapid growth in the digital economy, and this has caused an increase of demand in those areas, such as transportation, distribution centres, those sorts of things. Emerging scientific and medical fields to develop new treatments and vaccines, as we learned. But although there's an increase in jobs across some of these sectors, that it comes at a cost for some workers. So for example, we've seen a decline in jobs in bricks and mortar retail, the office support and hospitality industry that has supported office workers, which are now working remotely, and support workers. So what this kind of means at a larger level is that we're kind of seeing this kind of rapid need for upskilling or reskilling of people that need to change jobs and redeployment across some of these occupations and sectors. We're also seeing a change in demographics for who is working. And I know that Olga is going to be talking about this in a little while, but also thinking not just about immigrant workers and those newly entering the workforce, but also a change in our aging workforce and the need for more aged care in those areas. So recent data from McKinsey estimated that about 25% of workers globally will need to change occupations by 2030. And this is substantial and really impacts what's happening at the next level. So as I mentioned in the previous slide, the social, political, and economic environment really impacts the distribution of employment across sectors, with emerging and declining occupations and jobs in certain sectors. With this also comes a change in work arrangements. We're seeing an increase in non-standard work arrangements. So those gig arrangements, contract work, which offers workers flexibility, which is often something that, you know, we're looking for in our work, but it also offers employers flexibility to hire and lay off workers really quite easily to meet their changing demands or to reduce overhead costs. A lot of research has been done in this field to show that workers in non-standard arrangements, because they have fewer worker protections, are often at increased risk of injury. They have higher rates of income uncertainty. They don't know what their paycheck's going to look like next month, maybe next week. And these workers tend to be less able to voice concerns related to work, which can be problematic in terms of worker well-being. We're seeing a declining role of organised labour, which impacts how workers might also have a voice in safety, health and wellbeing initiatives and worker protections. And we're also seeing a rise in what's called the fissured workplace. And these are workplaces where you have multiple employers kind of operating on the one site. So if you think about like the standard office that we used to once upon a time go into and work, you might have the janitorial and the security services being contracted out. The cafeteria on site might also be managed externally by an external company, with the workers there being employed externally. So having multiple kind of workers on the one side having different employers also means that they have different benefits, they have different working conditions and different arrangements with their employer. The pandemic has also highlighted social and health disparities. We know that these existed, but they really were made glaringly obvious by the impacts of the pandemic. For example, we have higher rates of immigrant and workers from racial and ethnic minorities that work on our front line, or as essential workers, as they're called, during the pandemic. And many of these are low income. And these workers were disproportionately affected by the virus early in the pandemic. They continued to work in their physical workplaces and being exposed, which kind of further exacerbated these disparities. And these disparities haven't gone away since the pandemic, and are things that we are thinking about both in our research, but both employers are really starting to think about some of these disparities and how they can narrow them within their organisation as well. Younger workers were particularly impacted. New workers struggled to enter the workforce after they've completed education. There was fewer jobs. Many of them faced high levels of unemployment, had reduced access to training opportunities. And these workers were more likely to have a limited safety net. So they had less kind of money in their bank to cope with some of these economic shocks and job losses that they're experiencing. And we're still seeing the after effects of that, kind of moving past the kind of the peak of the pandemic. So these outer layers really shape the experiences and decisions of enterprises and workers. And as you can see in the model, we have like working conditions or the conditions of work being front and central to this. And in the current labour market, workers are really looking at their conditions of work. They're looking at what their job demands are. They're looking at how their work's designed. They're looking at things like what's in their physical work environment, their psychosocial work environment, their connections to their colleagues and their supervisor, and how their work is organised, so that how their shifts are scheduled. And what we're seeing, some of the trends that workers are really starting to think about is this increase in the intensification pace and workload that they have in their work. And we're seeing that workers are burnt out, that they're stressed by what they need to do in their work, and they're making decisions because of that, whether they stay at this workplace or potentially move to another job that doesn't have the workload, the same level of workload. Social connectedness, being valued and respected at work is really important, especially as we've kind of moved to these remote and hybrid work arrangements, where getting that social connectedness can be quite challenging. And employers have had to reimagine the way that these social connections actually can occur. Pay and benefits, of course, are one that, always come front of mind when you think about why workers might choose to stay in a certain job or leave. This became particularly obvious of late because we've had this increase in the cost of living and not a corresponding increase in pay. And so for workers that were already low wage or living paycheck to paycheck before the pandemic, now are really struggling to kind of make ends meet. Autonomy and control and flexibility is something that we're hearing a lot about, having the ability to work where, when, how you like. And also workers are starting to look at how their values really align with that of the organisation. What are they doing around things like community health? What are they doing with respect to climate change within the owner organisation and really having a minimal impact in that way? So workers are really kind of looking for a work that pays them a reasonable amount, but also kind of moves beyond that now. We're really seeing workers thinking about work that contributes positively to their lives, both at work, but outside of work. So working conditions are ultimately shaped in the policies, programs, and practices of that enterprise. So as we move beyond the pandemic, what we have learned is that wellness needs to be integrated within the organization. The safety, health, and well-being needs of workers needs to be part of the way that businesses fundamentally do the work or do business. Our centre has studied this extensively. I can't go into kind of details of all the various kind of solutions and the way to actually do this. But if you go to the centre's website, there's guidelines, there's a toolkit for how organisations can implement some of these approaches to really build their capacity to be able to think about worker safety, health, and well-being, and how to weave that into the fabric of their business. But some of the key characteristics of these types of approaches is that they're not an add-on. They're part of the way that work is done. And some of this is to do with engaging workers and workers being involved in identifying problems within the organisation, identifying ways that work can be done better or more efficiently, and co-creating some of these solutions. These types of approaches need to be responsive to changing working conditions and starting to anticipate some of the changes that we're seeing in the future of what work looks like and how work is structured. And the way that these approaches need to kind of look at, they need to kind of move beyond just looking at workers as being their well-being while they're at work, but really starting to think about how work impacts their lives outside of work, how the work that gets done impacts community health. And because of this, and because these approaches consider a systems approach and consider some of these things outside of the workplace, often these approaches tend to target multiple outcomes. They're not just targeting worker safety or worker health or just increasing productivity within the organization. They're looking at how all of these factors are interconnected and how, if we improve one, what is the knock-on effect? What are some of the unanticipated outcomes of putting in place these approaches, both good and bad? These types of approaches look at addressing inequalities within the workplace with respect to exposures and outcomes. So if organizations put in place these types of approaches, what can they expect? What is their return on investment? So some of the research that we have done both at our center and other total worker health centers has found that if you put in place policies, programs, and practices that are integrated within the fabric of your organization that improve the conditions of work, then you're likely to see some change in outcomes at the enterprise level. And these could be things like the workplace culture or a culture of health evolving. These could be a reduction in turnover, which is really important for employers at the moment, maintaining or improving productivity with these changes, reducing work absence and healthcare costs, which are particularly important for employers that provide health benefits for their workers. And what we saw during the pandemic is that workplaces that had really thought about this and integrated these types of approaches were more resilient. They were more able to kind of change the conditions of work with these kind of changes that we saw as a result of the pandemic in real time, to really kind of by engaging their workers in helping with this process. So identifying some of the challenges that they were facing and being able to put in place solutions rapidly to be able to keep their doors open and remain productive during that time. So as we kind of move down to the worker level, we've kind of talked about how all of these layers kind of impact the worker through the safety, health, and well-being of workers in the workforce. But I want to kind of draw your attention to thinking about some of the factors that workers are thinking about. And we've called this concept thriving from work, which is very much a holistic way of looking at worker well-being. And it's kind of thinking about how work and the experiences of workers with respect to their work and working conditions actually impacts their well-being, both at work, but also importantly in their lives outside of work. And over the last half a decade, I've kind of focused on what is needed to enable workers to thrive. We conducted a bunch of research talking to experts, we talked to workers, we did surveys of workers to really try and understand this concept. And what we developed was a wellbeing framework that consists of these 6 dimensions. And these dimensions, I'm kind of looking at the time, and I don't have a lot left, but these dimensions are outlined in the publication at the bottom of the screen in a lot of detail. And so these are things that workers are really kind of looking at that really contribute to their well-being in a positive way. So these are things like meaning and purpose in their work, having learning and growth opportunities at work, whether their values align with the organization. Thinking about social well-being from work, which was particularly important, thinking about remote and hybrid workplaces and how employers can look at some of these elements, like how do they ensure that workers feel like they belong, that there's fair treatment across workers, especially if you're in a workplace where some workers are remote and some workers aren't remote. How do you provide adequate supports for workers? How does work integrate with workers' lives outside of work? How do you ensure that the work doesn't creep over into their home lives outside of work, which is especially important now that we can be connected 24/7. Really thinking about the basic needs for well-being from work. So pay, as we've discussed, but also having the ability to be promoted within the organization so that you can earn more, you can have those learning and growth opportunities. Really thinking about workers' experience of how their job is designed and having some control over how their job is designed. Also thinking about whether workers have things like the resources to do their job. If they are working remotely, do they have all the resources that they need at home to be able to do that effectively? And of course, you know, physical safety, psychological safety, how levels of job stress, how work impacts on our energy levels and how exhausted we are at the end of the day are really important. So as I kind of wrap this up, I want to kind of leave you with three key themes. And those are worker wellbeing needs to be considered using a systems framework. We can't just kind of look at what's happening at the enterprise level. We really need to understand those layers that are around the enterprise and the worker levels to really understand how they impact those levels and how they change the way that enterprises and workers make decisions. Both workers and employers want to thrive. Employers want to be productive. They want to keep the doors open, but they also want their workers to be well and healthy, and workers really want that as well. To be able to do that, though, we need solutions that enable us to increase the resilience of these organizations, which became particularly evident during the pandemic. We need solutions that allow workers to be able to workplaces to deal with these external shocks that may not be anticipated, especially as we kind of start to look forward. So in saying that, I am going to pass you back to Todd.
Thank you, Susan. That was fantastic. One thing, we did have some questions come in around that toolkit that you mentioned.
Oh, yeah.
Is there a specific link you can point people to or instructions on where to find it on the center's website?
Yeah, so how about when Olga is presenting, if I put it in the chat, does everyone have access to that?
That's a good question. I'm going to assume if you put it in the chat, we will find a way to get it to everyone.
Okay,
even if they can't
I can put it in the chat while Olga's presenting, so I'm not taking up our time, me trying to find the link through. But yeah, if you go to the Center for Work Health and Wellbeing, the Harvard Center for Work Health and Wellbeing, there's a bunch of different resources on there. And we're adding to it all of the time. So one of the key things that the center does is not just research, we have a whole outreach arm. So a lot of what we're doing is developing resources and tools that employers, other practitioners can really pick up and use within their practice, but it also enables a kind of a mechanism that you can connect with us as well. So we're very open to people reaching out to us and asking questions. That's what we're all about. And so feel free to do that. If you can't find exactly what you want on the website or you've got more questions, then feel like you can get in contact with us.
Wonderful. And I have lots more questions myself, but we'll hold those to the end. Just a reminder to the people tuning in that we do have some time set aside for Q&A. So if you have questions, feel free to submit those. Olga, it's time to turn the spotlight onto you now. We can't really have a conversation about a labor shortage without talking about, immigration and newcomers, because we know that they're already the source of growth in Canada anyway, when it comes to the labor market. And I just wrote a story this week actually about, and you probably saw this, the federal government is looking to increase immigration. We're already at record levels, but they want to see that number go to 500,000 people annually by 2025. So that's a huge increase, and that's a huge talent pool coming in. So you've got a lot of expertise when it comes to newcomers and working with immigrants and even refugees. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on how we can tap into them as a potential labor source.
Thank you very much, Todd, and welcome. Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. I'd like to thank the Work Wellness Institute for inviting me and including me to be part of this important conversation. As Todd mentioned, I will be putting a spotlight on newcomers, in particular about talking about how we create workforces that are where newcomers can thrive, where they can truly feel a sense of fulfillment and belonging. And previously we talked about burnout and fatigue. My laptop experienced some Zoom fatigue this morning and refused to cooperate. So I'd like to thank Emma for helping me advance the slides at her end. So before I start speaking, I'd like to also mention why I am speaking to you today and what insights do I bring. I came to Canada as an immigrant 22 years ago, and I'm very fortunate that I was able to call Vancouver my home for the past 22 years. And Emma, if I can ask you to move to the next slide. And I was very fortunate to build a career in the not-for-profit sector. And truly privileged to today lead Mosaic, one of Canada's largest immigrant serving organizations. One thing that Canada is doing really well is that we have this substantial network of immigrant serving organizations supporting immigrants as they come in large numbers to Canada. And that remains to be an envy of the world. So that's the piece that is working really well. At Mosaic, we serve clients from 130 countries, clients of all ages, clients coming through all immigration streams. And for me, what's inspiring for me is not only what we do for our clients, it's also how we behave as an employer. Our workforce is predominantly people with lived experience as immigrants and refugees. And there's an incredible talent pool and capabilities that come, like it's really humbling to work with people who speak 5-6 languages actively. So when I speak to you today, I really bring the perspective, my lived experience as an immigrant, but also the 46 years of experience that Mosaic had serving newcomers in the Lower Mainland and supporting the settlement, language, and employment services. I'd like to talk next about why do we put a spotlight on newcomers? And as Todd mentioned before, in the next slide, Emma, immigrants, if you were able to look at the census data that were released not that long ago, close to 1 in 4 people in Canada are now foreign born. And that's the highest proportion among the G7. But when you look at the trend in 20 years, it is expected that 1/3 of Canadian population will be foreign born, meaning will be immigrants. And immigration already accounts for almost all of our labor force growth. Now, the targets that were announced by the Minister of Immigration, calling for about 1.5 million immigrants over the next 3 years, it's not really surprising. And you might have seen every year as the minister announced the targets go up every single year. And there is a reason for that. We're looking at our demographic trends, looking at our aging population, and especially looking at the shrinking ratio of adults, work-age adults, and retirees. We, as a country, rely heavily on immigration and will in the years to come. Through our immigration system, immigrants are always selected. Majority of them are selected based on their skills and their education and their experience. So they do represent a very vast talent pool. Well, on the next slide, I would like to explore, so this is all good news. What's happening though is that there is a huge mismatch between the jobs that newcomers held in their home countries and the jobs they are able to find in Canada. So Emma, if you could forward to the next slide. Only about 40% of immigrants work in skills commensurate jobs. That means working jobs that actually require that level of education that immigrants have. And what's even more worrying is that the very first 3 years are the most critical. Chances of finding a job in your field, if you don't find it in the first 3 years, the chances decrease dramatically. And what it also says that majority of immigrants work in jobs that provide very little financial stability and job security, often working multiple jobs with no benefits. So underutilization of talent and immigrant talent remains one of our key economic and social issues. And there is a huge cost to it. It's not only the lost tax revenue from potential income that the newcomers could earn, or the contribution to GDP that they could make. It's also the reputation, our reputation as a country that is at stake. Now, as a country who depend heavily on immigration, we also need to be very careful about our reputation. And until now, Canada has enjoyed a reputation of being the choice country, being the country where people want to go and immigrate. But we also need to realize that there is a global competition for talent. That Canada is not the only country who is looking to attract immigrants. And what we see increasingly is immigrants coming to Canada, not being able to utilize the skills and returning back to their countries. And that narrative of false hopes that Canada creates, that can be damaging to our reputation. So we as a country have to keep this in mind, and it's not something that the government is going to solve. It's not something that the settlement sector or immigrant serving organizations will solve. This is a societal topic. This is something that we all of us as employers need to address. I'd like to talk about additional thing, and this is really impacting our healthcare system and the immigrant health when we talk about well-being. We do, and many of you probably heard about the health immigrant effect. If you have immigrated to Canada, you know that part of the immigration process is a health check. And if you have any serious health conditions, you will not be able to come to Canada. So immigrants represent a very healthy group of individuals. They're in much better health than their Canadian counterparts upon arrival. But it's not the image that we see 6 years down the road. Studies show that immigrants' health tends to decline. And it's not surprising. If you have financial struggles, if you cannot find financially sustainable job, if you have to balance 2-3 jobs with no benefits, that adds to your stress levels. Many immigrants experience big changes in their social and economic status. Immigrants hold high-level positions in their home countries. They come here, often they have to start from the bottom again, and often not even finding jobs in their field. So that change into your social economic status does affect your well-being. And on top of that, you don't have the social and professional networks to support you through these difficult times because you left all of that behind in your home country. We also see that immigrants experience problems accessing Canadian health services. And sometimes it's about navigating how Canadian system works, but sometimes there are cultural differences where some countries do not speak about mental health. That topic is a taboo. That topic might not even have the vocabulary in the language, in that particular language. So it's not easy to seek help and to seek a mental health professional to talk about your problems. And all of these combined actually are so serious that Health Canada decided to include immigration as one of the social determinants of health. So if you can move to the next one. And we are really talking about the basics that Susan talked about, the basic needs that workers have. So what gets in the way? What gets in the way of getting stable and secure and well-paying jobs for immigrants? The first one is our continued focus and fascination with credential recognition. Yes, there are roles where credentials are important, but majority of roles do not require credentials and special certification. And we see a huge underemployment of newcomers also in non-regulated positions. The other focus is on our Canadian experience. Even though employers might not require it on the job postings, employers are looking for someone who can operate and who can function well, or there is some demonstrated ability to function in the Canadian context. But that really creates a vicious cycle, as you can imagine. Employers expect that ability to demonstrate that you are able to work in Canadian context, but no one provides the opportunity to actually gain that Canadian experience in your field. So what is really the biggest barrier is the lack of opportunities to prove yourself on a job, to be able to show your talent and the fact that you can in fact work effectively in the Canadian context. We hear a lot about lack of professional networks, and you have to rebuild that because we all depend on networks of peers that help us grow our careers. But the one that is also significant is the inability to wait for the perfect job. You know, you hear about a lot of loans and subsidies immigrants can receive once they arrive to Canada to upgrade their education and skills and get this certificate or that certificate. The reality is that migrants usually do not have the means to come and to go to school and to continue their education. Often they have to put food on the table. When I came 22 years ago, I was not able to go to school and work on my further certification. I needed to work to be able to provide for my family. And that is the reality for the vast majority of immigrants. So you will see them try to apply for jobs in their field, but not having the luxury to wait for the perfect job and taking whatever job can pay the bills. And that leads to really interesting resumes that many hiring professionals will see. Resumes that do not follow that traditional progression, that might have strange gaps or changes in the field of work. And those are not by design, those are by necessity. There's a lot of assumptions we make about language skills. When we see someone's resume with foreign sounding name, the first thing that comes to mind, well, will they be able to function in the Canadian context? Will they be able to speak English? And that's interesting to see also the latest statistics from Statistics Canada, from the census, that actually says 93% of recent immigrants spoke English or French. That's a really high percentage. So yes, there are definitely immigrants whose levels of English might be lower and they might need more support, but the vast majority of immigrants have functioning levels of English or French. So what is it that employers, all of us, can do? Because as I mentioned, this is not something that governments can change. This is where we as employers have to make a decision, intentional decision to create hiring strategies for immigrants and make sure that we do close that gap between the jobs they're able to get abroad and the jobs they're able to get here. And we have to be intentional about it, the same way as when you create strategies for hiring, for increasing representation of women or increasing representation of people with various levels of abilities. You really zoom in on the potential barriers and you address those barriers in your plan. So it has to be very intentional. The one thing you can all do as employers, I would really encourage you to do so, is to give newcomers a chance to prove themselves. You know, as a country, we really bought into the concept of hiring co-op students and interns. I think all of our companies have a plan to bring summer students and university students for these short-term work experiences. We understand these are great individuals, they're very talented, they have a lot of theoretical knowledge. They need to get that on-the-job experience to be able to get jobs later after they graduate. Well, the concept is no different for newcomers. They need that job in their field, in their area of expertise, to be able to go and grow their careers. You know, so consider creating those opportunities, whether it's 6, 8 months, 12 months internships where immigrants can come and actually work in their field, where they have a chance to prove themselves. And at the end, you might actually get a wonderful employee, or you might have provided an opportunity, a real work opportunity for immigrants, give them real feedback, and that will assist them in getting a job, the further job in Canada, but stay in their field of experience. Another thing we can do as employers is revisiting our hiring practices. Again, looking for evidence of desired competencies rather than job titles. Looking for problem-solving abilities, looking for critical thinking, and focusing on those rather than the titles and the natural progression that we like to see on the resumes of our candidates. And I know it's not easy. If you get 50 resumes, you know, you don't have much time to try to piece together the resumes that might not make most sense. But that's the key barrier that we see. We do need to take a little bit of time understanding the immigrant journeys. And please don't discard candidates who seem overqualified. Again, immigrants understand when they come, they might not be able to start at the same level they were in their country, but that they're at least hoping to find a job in their field. So they're really looking for positions and a position to get in the field and be able to grow their career there. So there is a reason they're overqualified. And please don't discard that. You'll get wonderful employees with tons of experience and expertise who are hoping to grow their careers within your organization. We hear a lot of companies talking about hiring for culture ed, not culture fit. There's research after research that shows that diversity of views and lived experiences around decision-making tables can benefit businesses. Then multicultural and multilingual teams are more innovative. So I'd like to stop at this because this was quite interesting for me. You might have seen there's a lot of surveys and studies that look at what are the most in-demand skills for the future. And there's a lot of surveys that various research institutes have done trying to piece what is it that employers are looking for going forward in the talent. And it's really interesting to see that employers are increasingly looking at soft skills, not technical skills. Technical skills can be taught. And those soft skills, they are mainly looking at things like adaptability, problem solving, managing change, resiliency, critical thinking. Those are the top 5 that keep emerging. And they are very hard to see in a resume or test for. But I'd like to leave you with one thought. When you think of an immigrant, someone who came and moved thousands of miles away, someone who started in a new country with no social networks and started from the beginning, that's firsthand demonstration of adaptability, of resilience, of problem solving, managing change, and really trying the ability to figure things out as they go. So please think of it the next time you see and you invite immigrants for interviews. I would like to touch a little bit on moving from the basic needs, so getting a job in your field, getting a job that actually provides financial stability and the benefits. And I'd like to move to really getting the sense of fulfillment and belonging. Because there's a lot of focus that we put on getting immigrants in their first jobs. And immigrants don't have a problem getting the first job, a job. They do have a problem getting a job in their field. And they also need support being able to grow their jobs. We are just completing a research project we've done with University of Victoria, looking at how immigrants progress once they were able to find a job in their field in an organization. How are they able to progress to executive positions? And based on the number of interviews we've done, there are certain themes that are emerging on what organizations could do that create that environment, that supportive environment where immigrants can grow their careers. One was around creating the system of champions. It's not only mentors, it's true that champions, people who actually advocate for you, people who create opportunities for those stretch projects that will help you get the next promotion. Individuals who help amplify your views and accomplishments. As an immigrant, it's very hard for us to go and sing our own praises. So you do need someone within the organization who can amplify your accomplishments and your successes and help build you that brand. One of the key feedbacks we've heard was around managing implicit biases. A lot of our interviews felt that they were passed over for promotion or even special projects, because somehow being an immigrant felt that they were not trusted with important projects, and they had to work twice as hard as others to be noticed. So I think as we all turn our eyes to equity, diversity, inclusion, I think it's really important to understand and systemically change and address the implicit biases that we all have. And it doesn't mean you have one training in 2 years and you check a box that all your employees completed. It is a journey and it is an ongoing focus, not only on recognizing your own implicit biases. For managers, it's about how do you support a multicultural workforce, how do you support and create opportunities for growth. It's about managing multicultural teams. Our workforce is increasingly diverse, and it's an essential skill for a manager to be able to and to have the capacity to manage multicultural teams. Another is focusing on clear and transparent promotion processes. Our interviewers said it's very hard to understand how promotions work, what it takes to be considered for promotion. And the last one to also focus on is that it's really the middle managers who are key in building inclusive work environments. Often the commitment to whether it's hiring immigrants or diversity inclusion comes from the executive team, but it is the middle managers who actually get to decide who gets hired, who gets promoted. And there's a lot of pressures and a lot of competing priorities that they deal with. So helping create that capacity for them and helping create those and embedding those targets, whether it's for EDI targets, into the goals, into the organizational goals and middle managers' goals, tying it to their work rather than treating it something on top of everything else that they can do, needs a special attention. And the last thing I'd like to talk about is in the last slide, I'd like to mention another thing you can do as an organization is to create opportunities for newcomers to have their voices heard in decision-making tables. So if you're an organization that has a board of directors, that has advisory committees, please consider creating opportunities for newcomers. In Metro Vancouver, over 40% of newcomers, residents are newcomers. We do not see that representation. So please help immigrants see themselves represented in decision-making tables, because that is ultimately what leads to the sense of belonging in our country. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Olga. That was fantastic. I think, I've been covering the HR profession and employers for a long time, and we've talked so much about that concept of culture fit. Mm-hmm. And I think culture add is it's a much more compelling kind of strategy to adapt now. So Susan, maybe we'll get you back on camera as well now, have a little bit of a conversation before we get into some of the questions from the audience. So one of the things, we were talking about earlier was this whole notion about, building a workforce that's resilient to change, right? Which is a very admirable goal. It's very important to do. I think one thing that we've seen, and I don't want to be the cynical person in the room, but I guess as a journalist, that's my job, is to be cynical sometimes. But just, we've often seen these types of workplace initiatives fail, and not just resilience programs, but almost any initiative you roll out, because you don't get buy-in from those frontline managers, right? They can get a little, cynical. They don't buy into it. Therefore, they don't cascade it down to their staff. So how can we ensure that any kind of program that we do is going to be successful and not, to get that buy-in from those key managers?
Yeah, it's a great question. Yeah, we all know that managers can be really critical for making or breaking the implementation of an initiative. And I think one of the key things here is to actually remember that managers are a key part of the workforce and a key part of that group. And so really kind of starting to think about how these initiatives can be integrated into their roles, to be part of their KPIs, that they actually have the resources and supports in place to be able to put in place these initiatives, that they're not just kind of tacked on or added onto their existing workload. Really thinking about, how these managers might be feeling like they're being stretched in a gazillion different directions, and really trying to, nearly do an assessment of what can be improved. I think another key part is really kind of thinking about managers' well-being as well, like thinking through, my Thriving from Work framework. We, as kind of a way of thinking about how are we meeting the needs, the managers' needs within the organization? How are we ensuring that they're thriving? Because we know that if they're thriving, then their workers are going to be thriving. If a manager is supporting an initiative because they see it's important, it's going to benefit them as well as their workers, then it's more likely that they're going to put it in place or implement it and support it and engage their workers in supporting it as well. So, yeah, I think that's probably the key point. And managers often are kind of targeted as kind of the people that kind of cause this initiative to fail. And I think we need to just take a step back and not kind of put all the pressure on them, but really, make sure that we're really supporting them and giving them the best chance possible to be able to implement these initiatives within their roles and making sure that they can do it effectively.
Great, thanks, Susan. And Olga, kind of in the same vein, we'll keep the heat on the middle managers for a minute anyway. Though you're right, we should, that they do have to do a lot. But when I think about, hiring newcomers and new Canadians, our hearts are often in the right place, at least, we hope they are. But sometimes our minds aren't quite tuned in. We don't realize that, right? Any suggestions on how hiring managers can kind of overcome that unconscious bias that might creep in? They might not realize what they're doing, but, they often end up hiring somebody they want to go for a beer with after work, or somebody they get along with, rather than the best person for the job.
Yeah, and you're absolutely right. I think, again, it goes to not hoping and relying on managers to act independent, because we see managers who are so keen on hiring immigrants, but you can't expect, it shouldn't be left to an individual. We were really looking for systemic change. So one thing is, I think addressing implicit biases is just so important, and even changing our narrative around it, because we all have implicit biases. It doesn't mean we are bad people. We all grew up with certain biases. We were raised certain ways. We watched certain movies. We all have them. So how do we work on recognizing them and addressing them? And again, you see a lot of organizations having focus on EDI. But one thing is, let's make sure this is truly seen as a journey. This is not a one-off where you run a organization-wide workshop, you click a box, everyone attended the workshop, let's move on to how we were doing things before. This should be ongoing. And that's why it's not only the implicit bias in hiring, that's one part. Implicit bias on how you manage your team. Are you making sure that everyone has their voice heard? Are you sure that you are giving opportunities to each of them to shine? It's also managing multicultural teams. So there is, I think, the key is on systemic work within the organization, not do it like one-off and move on. This is a journey. This is not something that organization will change in 1 or 2 workshops. But the other thing that I would suggest, that if you are to introduce a few checklists. For example, if you're hiring and you are creating, you review your resumes and you create a short list. Statistically, 40% of Metro Vancouver residents are immigrants. So 40% of your shortlisted candidates should be immigrants. So just having and pausing is like, so looking at my shortlist, am I way off? And if I am, why? And that's like a reminder to say, well, let's go back to that. What have I not seen? What have I not been trying to consider? So putting some of those checklists and data actually helps checking us and pausing. It's like, do we need to rethink how we are looking at hiring?
A great point. A little bit kind of leads to my next question, which I'll stick with you for a second. If we think about how companies are finding, attracting candidates, there's some tried and true ways. There's the easy ones, like throwing it up on LinkedIn and recruiting that way. You can put an advertisement in, any kind of online job board that's niche for maybe your specific sector. Are there different ways to reach new Canadians that employers and hiring managers may not be aware of?
I think I would really encourage hiring managers, if they are looking for newcomer talent, please come talk to the immigrant serving organization. There are many of them. There is a very good coverage. Come talk to Mosaic. One of our key priorities, not just work with immigrants. We work with about 1,000 of employers, trying to help them access talent, but also create work places that are inclusive and they are welcoming. Because we want newcomers to thrive and to succeed. We don't want newcomers to quit after 2 weeks because they just don't feel included. So please talk to the immigrant serving organization nearby. There's a lot of expertise and supports in place. And there are people who can guide you in creating those hiring processes, in facilitating access to newcomers, and often even pre-vetting candidates for you. So to go to where the candidates are.
Right, no, for sure. That's very critical to make sure you get that pool that you can pick from, so you are getting the best people. Susan, one thing that you said, I'm going to bounce around a little bit here. During your presentation, you said that about, I think it was 25% of workers are going to need to change occupations by 2030, which is huge. Any insight into like why that is and the types of occupations that will need to change?
Yeah, so I think what we're seeing is there's a lot of different factors at play here. So we're seeing that there's a lot of emerging fields, so we need to fill those jobs. Those jobs are important. So workers that are kind of being trained at the moment that are going through, higher education, there's more opportunities for courses, for obtaining those skills in those jobs and making sure that they're available so that we can fill those jobs when they're available. But we're just seeing, because of what's happening at the social, political, and economic level, we're just seeing fundamentally that, consumer behaviors are changing. So as I mentioned, we're shopping a lot more online. We're doing a lot more with technology now. So those jobs are improving. But also, if we're shopping more online, those products still have to get to us. So distribution and transportation are huge industries at the moment. We've seen a rapid increase in those regions. But we're also, because of technology and AI, robotics, those sorts of things, we're seeing a lot more roles of jobs evolving there. Taking a step back and not just thinking about the sectors that are changing, but we're seeing a change in demographics. So I'm just going to give one example. So we've got an aging workforce. So if you're a construction worker that has done physical work all of your life, but you can't afford to retire at the normal standard retirement age, and you need to contain that, but you may not be able to do the physical work that you've already done. You may not have higher education, so your skills might be limited. And so really starting to think about how we either support those workers to remain in their existing occupation and what that could be, especially if they haven't had those promotional opportunities that are important to get up to those kind of more managerial kind of positions. Or how do we reskill those workers so that they are still remaining as productive workers in the workforce? They're still getting, they're still meaningfully and gainfully employed. And so I think, there's a lot of these different factors at play that's really kind of making us think about, where workers are going, where workers have to change to, and that's probably going to continue to change over the next decade as we're kind of seeing these changes in the future of work and some of the working conditions that those workers are exposed to, such as physical demands.
Sure, and we know that some roles, we've seen this through the pandemic, some roles can be done very successfully remotely. Mm-hmm. Some of them cannot be, right? So, we've got the situation already today, but that's going to continue based on what you're saying. It's going to continue happening where you have some roles that you can do, from home or from a different location, and some that, no, you've got to get up and you've got to drive to the work site and actually perform the work in person. So we've seen a little bit of kind of almost jealousy, I would say, with some workers kind of looking at, the workers that could never stay home. They look at these workers who are working remote and saying, oh, they're a little bit out of touch with what we're actually working with because they're still at home, or maybe even they're lazy. So what can be done for workers whose work can't change to make it more appealing so you don't lose those people?
Yeah, that's a really tough one, because the other side of the coin is that workers are also looking at the attractiveness of some of those more flexible work options, especially if they're a younger person and they're about to start a family and thinking about how they can maintain employment, that's more flexible with their lives, and they're thinking about, well, I need to go back and retrain and do something else to be able to do that. And so we're certainly seeing that side of things. I think, it's really challenging for employers that do have, for example, frontline workers that have to go into the physical workplace. And then they've got workers that, for example, sit in a corporate office somewhere else. And some of that might be an equity issue, that the people that are getting paid less actually have to go into the physical workplaces, and potentially the people that are getting paid more are sitting at that corporate level and can work remotely. And so really kind of thinking about what are the conditions of work that could be improved for those workers? What are there options for flexibility? Can you put in place things like them having more discretion over which shifts, for example, that they do, so that can meet their work family requirements? I think another part of it is existing workplace culture. what's the workplace culture like in that organization? And do we need to take a step back and really kind of think about what it is, what is the root cause for some of this feeling that's happening within these organizations where it's like, well, office workers are lazy. We know that's not the case. There's lots of research saying that people working remotely are just as productive or even more productive because they have those options. It gives them the flexibility to be able to do the work when they can do it. They enjoy work more because they have that flexibility. They don't have to spend 2 hours commuting to get to the workplace when they can do that at home. Why should I sit in my cubicle where I don't speak to anyone all day when I could be at home? And in my lunch break, I can eat the food I want to eat. I can do the exercise that I want to do potentially, and then go back to work and have an effective, productive afternoon. So I think there's lots of different pieces to your question, Todd. But I think, the key is to take a step back and look at what's happening within your own organization.
Sure. Okay. Well, we're going to switch gears again, come back to you. You talked a little bit about, Canada is in a very enviable position in terms of we are a destination of choice. But as you said, that there's a risk that we'll lose that if the experience isn't great. So how do we get, if we think about, false hope and things like the requirement of Canadian experience, those are all roadblocks. As a small business, like if you're hiring somebody for the first time who is a non-Canadian or a new Canadian, how can they, where do they start? How can you evaluate, foreign skills and experience so they don't miss out on this talent?
And again, I think it comes down to looking at transferable skills rather than actually the title positions that people held in the past. And that's why if you're trying to hire immigrants, rather than when you do your job posting, rather than writing, well, we want, just think about the posting in terms of, would it speak to a newcomer? If you're looking for someone who has demonstrated experience working in Canada, well, they might not have it. If you're looking for someone who held this particular position, if you expect X years in this particular, well, they might not have had it in the country. So when you look at posting positions, look more in terms of what are the competencies you're looking for, what are the skills looking for, rather than what are the previous held jobs that you're looking for. So that's on the hiring side. When you're assessing, one of the great tools that I think we should consider is that concept of, you could try bring immigrant professionals through an internship. Like this is, the Canadian government has done a lot of study on credentialing and what actually helps get people in the jobs that they were trained for. And actually it's finding it's really the first job experience. So what the models and that work really well is that first job experience. So if you're an organization, and why don't you consider building a plan where every year you bring 2 or 3 immigrants on a skilled internship, let's say, where it's a consideration that yes, the immigrant will bring a lot of experience, but you as an employer will also provide some time training them. At the end, it's a great time to test new talent. And also it gives you more of an experience working with immigrants. Because as long as immigrants remain outside of organization, it's something unknown, it's very hard to see, well, how do we evaluate? As you start bringing immigrants inside of the organization, the way you look at candidates will change. So making immigrants more or less of the unknown, bringing them in and having opportunities where, yes, you might not get a person who has everything, recognizing that we as employers will play a role in upskilling, in training, and more and more, this is what the role that employers will make. So if you can consider bringing immigrants for these positions where they have a chance to test and showcase their talent.
Great, thank you, Olga, appreciate that. So we've got about 10 minutes left now. So I'm going to turn to some of the questions coming in from the audience. The first one here is for Dr. Peters. It says, you've talked about system resilience. In your view, how does this approach differ from one of individual employee resilience in terms of its potential impact on addressing labor market gaps?
Well, I think they're related. So enterprises need to be resilient so that a system can be resilient. And it really, I guess, sort of stems back at kind of where you're looking at that system kind of lying. I mean, you know, so many organizations, so much of what we do is dependent on what other enterprises do. And if, you know, you don't have individual enterprises being able to be resilient, especially in a certain sector that's really important, and often they're the sectors that have, you know, a high percentage of small and medium-sized businesses that often really struggle with, you know, some of these really huge economic, you know, social political shocks that can happen in a system. So I think one of the things is like thinking about, you know, who are those enterprises that are going to be most affected by this? And how do we make sure that they're able to be more resilient? And they're usually the small and medium-sized businesses. We did a research study looking at small and medium-sized businesses in the construction industry. And one of the program that we were putting in place, we were kind of putting in place one of those integrated approaches programs where what the program really looked at fundamentally was workers being able to have a mechanism to be able to communicate what was happening at their work sites in real time, so that managers that often don't sit at the work site sit in an office remotely because they've got multiple crews on multiple different work sites could put in place solutions in real time. So we're building these kind of communication mechanisms. And that intervention was happening before the pandemic, and then the pandemic hit. And one of the key things was that we were delivering this intervention kind of at sites. We were building capacity within these organizations. And then all of a sudden, we weren't able to do that. We weren't allowed to go on site, but these companies were reaching out to us going, this is really helpful. Like, we're learning stuff about, like, we're being told that, you know, workers can't have to wear masks, but when they wear masks, their glasses or their safety glasses fog up. And so that can be really dangerous on a construction site. And so what we're learning is that these issues are happening and we can put in place solutions so that they don't have these health and safety risks. But we need to learn how to do this ourselves. And so we had to totally change the way we're doing it so that they could keep working and not shut down. And so that was kind of something that was really kind of critical. And we've really changed the way that we're kind of doing our research now, rather than, you know, we still go out and we develop things and we test things to see if they are effective, but we're engaging a lot more with our companies or with our community stakeholders up front to really kind of co-create even our research projects, our kind of innovations that we're kind of coming up, we're co-creating them with them. And we always did that to an extent, but during the pandemic, it just became a lot more important. So.
No, that's great. The next comment, we've got a comment and a question that are kind of tied together. So our conversation around middle managers has certainly resonated. People are thanking us for acknowledging that, especially this one person said, if their manager doesn't see the need to be a compassionate leader. So yeah, there's universal recognition of the crunch on those professionals. This next question is aimed for you, Olga. You spoke of middle managers being the key to building an inclusive work environment, and you shared some ideas to support that. What do you think it will take for senior leaders to actually put the resources and structures in place to support those middle managers?
And that's a very good question. We actually, as an organization, are going through the same. And one thing is to recognize, if we are doing that work, if we are trying to create inclusive workplaces and trying to build inclusivity inside of what we do, it cannot be something driven by the executive. It cannot be the executive saying, well, we shall be such. It is really a bottom-up approach. It is really getting the buy-in from the bottom up and understand what the barriers are in each area. And then co-create, because this can be something that, yes, we do on the side of our desk. That needs to reflect in our strategic plan, in our organizational priorities and budgets. We all go through annual planning processes. This is not an add-on that somehow lives, and by the way, we also do this. So if people see it reflected in your strategic plan, in your organizational goals, in your performance evaluations as a manager, then it becomes real. Then it becomes a real priority. As long as if we don't do that, it lives outside. But again, creating these structures, creating the goals, creating the the KPIs, what are we measuring, how are we evaluating each other, that should not be created by and imposed by the executive. It really needs to be the bottom-up approach to get the buy-in and understand the concerns at the various levels of the organization. That's why the EDI journey is such a long and ongoing process. It's not a quick fix. Doesn't mean just we'll change a policy, we are done. It really requires commitment by organizations.
Great. And Susan, I don't know if you have any additional thoughts on what it's going to take to get senior leaders to really provide that support.
Well, I think you need to get that support and that commitment from your senior leaders before anything can happen at the bottom level. Because often what happens is that middle managers or workers look to their leadership to see whether this is something they should do. But I think in terms of putting in place these types of initiatives, once you have that support from senior leadership, actually kind of, we're talking about you should start from the bottom up, but I think sometimes we need to start in the middle. Like we need to actually start in the middle to see what resources, supports managers need, what policies, programs, practices need to be put in place to support them, building it into their performance evaluations, like Olga mentioned, those sorts of things, so that it's important and you get the buy-in at that level. They see the importance before you start to kind of, move to the bottom and try and work up and engage workers, because you need that support at that middle management level before you engage workers to be involved in some of these initiatives.
Great, thanks for that. Next question here. It's talking about, it's obviously aimed at newcomers here, but it could apply to either one of you, but I'll direct it to you, Olga, to start. I'm just wondering if employers are considering the impact that personal stressors outside of work are having on the workplace. So, they're talking here about mental health, addictions, divorce, poverty, limited access to healthy social supports. So is that something that employers, do you think, are doing a good job at looking at for both newcomers and for Canadians?
I think what the pandemic actually encouraged us to do so. For example, at Mosaic, we have 470 employees. When COVID hit and we moved working remotely, that brought a lot of this discussion. Well, how are we able to work from home? Do we have an environment? What happens to childcare when schools are closed? So that really triggered more of the conversations to be had and actually understand. And the same with bringing people back to the office, right? Like as we're trying what works, we're very much attuned now to what is happening in people's personal lives, what matters to them. So I think with the pandemic, that definitely escalated and increased the level of conversations we have to understand what matters and what are the personal circumstances of individuals to ensure that they can be successful in their jobs.
Sure, Susan, anything you want to add?
Yeah, I think part of this is that, as Olga mentioned, during the pandemic, it became very obvious that our work lives and our outside of work lives are very much intertwined. And we had to make accommodations for people that, had childcare issues, those sorts of things. And managers had to kind of navigate that in a way. So I don't think those problems really go away. We had those problems before the pandemic. Some of them became way more obvious during the pandemic. We had to do something about it. But I think, the important thing was that the relationship there was often between the frontline worker and the manager, and making sure that the manager has the resources, the supports in place to be able to take on that role, because people are still doing this, and knowing that when it is outside of their actual role or function within the organization, where to direct these people to. Is there an employee assistance program that can actually help to deal with these issues so that you as the manager aren't taking on all of the challenges of all of your workers, and making sure that managers also have the right supports in place so that if they are learning about these things, it's hard for a manager not to take that on board and really carry that weight around with them. And so making sure that they have the supports in place to be able to be the most effective manager for the workers that they look after.
Great, thank you. And I'm going to squeeze one more question in. We're just about out of time, but this will be the last one. There's so many, these things go by so fast, it's too bad. But so quickly, I think this probably is for you, Susan. Who's responsible for retraining as the economy evolves and these jobs change? Is it government? Is it private sector employers? Is it the workers themselves?
That's a great question. And I'm not sure I have the answer to it. I think this is something that we're really grappling with at the moment. I think it's going to take a multi-pronged approach. I know I've done a lot of work in the construction industry, and I'm working with like large construction employers and starting to think about that. Large employers often have the resources to start to think about these types of things. And if you're a really proactive, engaged employer often, and you know that you're going to face this challenge, or you're already facing this challenge within the workforce, then you're likely putting things in place like, are there technological kind of things that can be put in place, such as robotics? We're seeing, external exoskeletons helping aging workers to, there's all sorts of things that are being tested, I think, at that level. I also think there needs to be something that happens at a higher level, at the public policy level, and really sort of thinking about the supports for these workers. Are there programs in place to help retrain them? And where is that funding coming from? So I think, we really need to look at it from multiple different levels. I also think, when going back to my example in construction, just because that's front of mind at the moment, when you have somebody who's entering in the workforce, thinking about their training, their orientation, their apprenticeship, their internship, starting to think about what the lifespan of their employment trajectory, what they would like it to look like, and really starting to think about like, how can they protect their health and safety in those early stages to keep them productive in those physically demanding jobs? Are there additional trainings that person's going to need along their employment trajectory to enable them to, be promoted or have those opportunities for learning and growth within the profession, so that those people can transition up into other roles within the organization that they can do as they get older? So I think, it'll take thinking about that systems approach is going to take multiple people at multiple different levels really thinking about this, and to have an effective solution.
Wonderful. Thanks, Susan. I think Emma's about to pull us off the stage, but I just want to say thanks to both of you. I really enjoyed our conversation. Olga, thanks for your time. Susan, thanks as well. As always, learned a lot through our conversation, and appreciate it.
No problem. My pleasure.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Todd, Susan, and Olga, for that extremely engaging discussion. And unfortunately, we have reached our time for our first panel. So I will leave everyone with a few notes. First off, the presentation was recorded and it will be posted for free on our eCampus along with the slides. And as a reminder, the slides are located at the bottom of your Feedloop page under Files, should you want to take them now and have a closer look. If you're interested in receiving a certificate of attendance, please navigate to the Accreditation Opportunities page in the menu on the left-hand side of your screen. By purchasing all 3 certificates today, you will receive an annual WWI membership, guaranteeing you unlimited certificates for e-courses, webinars, and more. Organizational and individual WWI members, you will be receiving a free certificate. Our next session, Supporting Disclosure and Addressing Burnout, begins at 10:45, so in just under 15 minutes. In the meantime, we've created an active break for you and encourage you to also explore the exhibitor hall, have a conversation with a fellow attendee in networking, and make sure you keep an eye out for our live graphic recording of today's conference, which will be coming soon in the infographic gallery. You'll also find current research project and posters there. You may also have seen or heard about our Workistic prize. In our Workistic app, which you can download in the Apple Store or on Google Play, you'll discover new short style resources through interviews, summaries, and research findings. And one lucky winner will be randomly selected from those who download the app today to win a 1-year individual membership with unlimited certificates. So make sure you download the app today. And before we leave this page, please remember to fill out the session survey, which you will find linked in the description. Thank you, everybody, and I look forward to seeing you soon. Have a great rest of your day.